Hello, everybody. My name is Father Rob Carbonneau, and I welcome you here. I ask that you kindly keep yourself on mute during this presentation. There will be a time at the end of the presentation when you will be able to either use questions. We probably are going to use chat or possibly using by the screen as well if you raise your hand. But this presentation is approximately 45 minutes long. There'll be a Q&A opportunity, and that is the way that the process will go. But again, please keep yourself on mute. That would be very good and most helpful for all people concerned. So I will begin. Again, my name is Father Rob Carbonneau. I'm a Passionist priest. I'm historian for the Passionist congregation. And this presentation is sponsored by Holy Cross Province. I'm part of the committee of proclaiming our Passionist story. I'm also a member of St. Paul La Crosse Province, which is of the Americas based out of New York. And I'm a director emeritus of the U.S.-China Catholic Association, which is based in Berkeley, and also an archival specialist at the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History at Boston College. And I'm an adjunct faculty member for the University of Scranton in the history department. And that's where also part of the Passionist archives are. The archives, the image-driven material that you will see here is at the Ricci Institute for Chinese Western Cultural History. It's been digitized, and you'll hear more of that. So I'm going to start right in and continue with this story. I want to, first of all, say that this is a momentous event in the history of the Passionist congregation and the history of the Holy See and U.S. State Department relations in the 20th century. To frame it in some way, even though I will not discuss this perspective, it has all the impact, at least in my knowledge, of the death of the women in El Salvador in 1980. So the way in which that was a human interest, political interest, and human rights and question of martyrdom, it has, from 1929 when this took place to this point, the same type of merit, I think, of study. But let me just go through a couple points that I hope to capture here. And again, I urge you to stay mute as you come in. This is a 95th remembrance of this event that took place in 1929. I'm going to offer a basic history of the event, but I'm not going to concentrate on that history. Instead, I'm going to take and explain the new perspectives that have emerged really over the last 32 years when I defended my PhD in 1992 at Georgetown University. So that defense gave me this basic core of a story, and it's emerged through other research and other particulars. I will mix historical analysis and personal insight together, and I'm going to reflect on how this historic event has impacted me as a historian, a scholar, a Passionist religious, and a priest. So I ask you to keep in mind as you go through and watch this presentation, why does this 1929 event have any impact, and still what does this teach us in 2024? How does this event speak to you about contemporary and past realities in China? And how does this event give you insight into world faith or cross-cultural relationships? So that is really the purpose of this lecture as a large arc of questions. So what I want to do here is start in and first of all show you this image. Now, what's important about this image here is this is an indication of how actually my research has shifted from the time that I actually did this doctoral dissertation at Georgetown in from 1985 to 1992. When I did this research, what I had to do was I knew that this research was generated a great deal of public interest in the news, in the Catholic news press at that time. So what I did was I went to the Catholic University of America Library in Washington, D.C., and on microfilm, I spent close to a good month actually looking at Catholic newspapers. They have a great run on microfilm of Catholic newspapers. And I sectioned out this period of 1929, and I tried to figure out how was this event captured in the press of 1929 when these three American Catholic priests were murdered. And that was pretty much a microfilm event. I did not do anything with the images in the dissertation. It ended up really as being part of a graph that's in the dissertation itself. And so that was of interest. But now, and this goes to show you, and this is one of the key points in this presentation that I hope we think about a little bit, the access to understand events now has completely changed. This, what you see, comes through the Catholic News Archive developed by ATLA, which is a library service, and the Catholic Research Alliance. And by putting in the name, if you go to the link that's up there, you can put in, for instance, Walter Coveyou, 1929, Godfrey Holbein, 1929, or Clement Seybold, 1929. And there's only a limited amount, but you can get a very good indication of how this emerged in the press. Important to note here, as you're looking at the image, on the left, you will actually see the news feed. The National Catholic Welfare Conference, which predates the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the National Catholic Welfare Conference put together news feeds on respective topics, and they would put it out to the public, and then the secular press, but mostly the religious press, would handle it, and then they would edit it, the Catholic newspapers, according to the interest of their local audience. Here you see the Catholic Telegraph from Cincinnati, Ohio, and that's where Walter Coveyou was from. So you see, actually, it's cut off a little bit, but it says an order of three Passionist priests described in the murder of three Passionist priests described in the letter. So this is front page news. So you can imagine what really took place here as this news hit in the spring of 1929. It hit in Catholic and secular and international papers all across the world, actually, but certainly in the United States. So you can imagine what it was like, because these newspapers were so important, of waking up in the morning, anyone who had a Passionist connection, especially in the various places where Passionist monasteries were in the United States. This was a shock, this was a reality, and this was a world event. This was in the New York Times. So what you see here is the press development in the public discourse of how this murder actually ended up coming into play. Now, there's another area that's important to consider, and this is in papers relating to the foreign relations of the United States. And this is published regularly by the State Department. One of the key dynamics that made me realize that this was worthy of a dissertation was that this edited volume, and it deals with topics that the U.S. Department of State handles all throughout the world. It begins in the 1850s. So you can go into the library, and that's what I did. Good research libraries have this in bound volumes. And in 1992, you could only find them in bound volumes. Now, actually, you can go online and do a search of this. So again, I put in Coveyou into the search idea of 1929, and I came up with foreign relations, and the death and the murder was actually in foreign relations as an edited volume, partly in volume 2. And you can see here the case number, 393.1123, Coveyou Walter, and this is the first document in the actual archive material that's in the National Archives of the United States. It's a telegram. Why is Coveyou first? Because it's done alphabetically. So in this particular aspect, the Consul General in Hankow sends a message to the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C., approximately 3 days after the murder, saying that Clement Seybold and Godfrey Holbein have been murdered in Chenxi, Hunan on the 4th, and now the matter is being taken up by Chinese authorities. So immediately, the murder is made public and it goes right to the Secretary of State. Why? Because an American citizen or 3 American citizens are killed abroad, and Lockhart is one of the key people in the consulate in Hankow. So it goes through a couple iterations of different material, and a key aspect here of this particular case, and this is what I pursued in my dissertation thesis, was by the time the case ends, so there's 39 references, but only a couple of them are actually published in Foreign Relations of the United States. By the time this case is followed, and this again is from Frews, I call it, it says that halfway through, they say, we have found the murderers and they've been executed. By the time they get now to November, months after this murder, what the diplomatic traffic says, and this goes from the American minister to the Chinese foreign minister, so McMurray to C.T. Wong, it says this still is an open investigation. Really, the bandits who were supposed to be punished were not punished, and it looks like the real murderers are still loose. So this is an important document, and you see it says it appears that misinformation and this whole case has not been followed through in a very good way. So this is a key diplomatic issue that this Foreign Relations of the United States deals with, and that's one of the areas that I started to look at in doing this particular thesis. So here are the men, and you see from left as you're looking at the screen, Godfrey Holbein. In the middle is Clement Seybold, and with the hat on the right, as you look at it, is Walter Coveyou. The big question here, and right from the start, is, and I've heard this question since I began researching this, is are these priests martyrs? And this was even a question in the literature of the time, and it's often raised when people reflect on this. I'm not going to address it at this moment, but suffice to say that I've been, the technical side of this is that they probably were not considered martyrs at the time, but culturally they were, and the implications of this is important. You might take notice here, and this is what the imagery is done. And again, I did not use this imagery in my PhD defense thesis. I used the written textual evidence. But you can see Holbein, he's holding a cigarette. Now, Sign Magazine, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and the missionaries in Union City, New Jersey, where this mission generated from, this Passionist mission to China, they got very upset when the missionary photographs were taken, and it took time to take these photographs, when they had cigarettes. When the missionaries had cigarettes, they said, we can't use them. You can't scandalize the public by smoking a cigarette. So there's details about these photos that show the humanity of the men, that show the reality of the press. And so this are the 3 men in question, Godfrey Holbein, Clement Seybold, and Walter Coveyou. Now, here actually is when the death took place, you see their caskets here, but you also see the graves, and their graves are traditional graves. Again, the imagery tells you something here, but you also notice that there's not just 3 men, there's a 4th person. So that's Constantine Leach, who died of typhus and disease. So when I did my defense in Georgetown on April 7th, of 1992. The defense started late at Georgetown. My sister Beth actually was waiting for me. And because it started late, it seemed like eternity for her waiting. So I looked at this whole thesis, and the simple point here is Coveyou, who went actually in 1928 to China. As I began to look at his life, he represents missionary home support. He actually raised money and was pleased and finally so happy to get to China. But soon after being in China, he was murdered. But actually, his home support is key. So any mission internationally needs home support, and Coveyou actually sees that as a key symbol, and that is often forgotten. So spiritual and missionary home support, his life and his study in this triple biography is key. Clement Seybold, he's a well-adjusted missionary. He seems to embrace the language quite well. He stands up at times as a stamina of faith. In the 1920s, he goes in 1924, as does Holbein. And what happens is Seybold adjusts quite well. In contrast, Godfrey Holbein has a great deal of anxiety, and his anxious ideas were somewhat, I think, difficult cultural adjustment. He wanted to actually leave and go back and work with Negroes, American blacks, the Negro mission in the Carolinas, which had opened up. He actually got permission to go home, but the permission was slow in being actually produced. So actually what happened here was he was not sent home, and so he was actually killed at this time as well. And Constantine Leach died of typhus. So you have disease, you have missionary anxiety, a well-adjusted missionary, and home support. One of the things over time now that's made sense to me is we have all these personalities. So the toughest question I had on my defense for my PhD was not from my committee. When my sister Beth met me, we went down for a beer at the Tombs in Georgetown. It was the mid-afternoon, and all I wanted was a beer. And my sister Beth, who had seen me go through this study for a long time because she was a student at Catholic U while I was doing this, she said, "Okay, Rob, you've looked at these guys' lives and you've talked about their different identities. Which one are you most like?" And that actually completely shocked me. That was the toughest question. My sister asked me the toughest question, but it's a very probing question because all of us in our lifetime demand support from home or our families. All of us at times adjust well. All of us live with real anxieties, and all of us can get disease. This is our life as humanity, and this was their life in China. Now, basic overview here. You have here that the missionaries were, by 1921 to 48, 79 priests and one brother went to China. You had Sisters of Charity from Convent Station, 23 Chinese members eventually. Sisters of St. Joseph from Baden, Pennsylvania, you had 16 members and one Chinese member. So all of these missionaries worked in the West Hunan sector, and Sign magazine, which was actually a magazine published by the East Coast Passionists and promoted by both provinces out of Chicago and out of Union City, New Jersey, they would run a regular feature called With the Passionists in China, and that made the mission come to life for the subscribers of Sign magazine. Here you have an idea of the Yangtze River. So you see actually the map, full map of China. You see on the right, Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan. Wuhan actually is a tri-city of Hankou, Hanyang, and Wuchang. And it really was not named Wuhan until post-1949. So it was always known as a three-city area, and it's important in political and Chinese history. And you see this, what I call Yangtze River Catholicism, because this was a conduit for many Catholic missionaries to get into the interior of China. When you actually get into the mission of Hunan, you see in the lower inset where Hunan province is. So it's in the interior. And if you look at the map, you see Changsha, which is the capital. And on the left-hand side of the province, you see Yuanling. That was the center of the Passionist mission. And you see Huaihua. Huaihua now is a major thriving city. It was a small hamlet at the time when the Passionists were there in the 20s. And you see along the river there by Yuanling, the Yuan River. That was a key river of transit. All that area in Yuanling and Huaihua is a very important isolated area separated by mountains to the capital. So West Hunan had its own identity and its own reality of existence. And the Passionists went there in 1921, pretty much just to go there and serve that local people. I should say something about the Passionists when they went there. Go back to this photo. None of them had language training. None of them had any type of understanding. And Propaganda Fide out of Rome was the group that actually said, you're going to go to West Hunan. The Passionists were actually excited to go there. And it was the idea of the romance, the service to China. And so they went there with no training at all, which is quite remarkable when you stop to think about it. So when I was actually trying to figure out what to do and understand West Hunan and figure out the whole culture there, and I started to read the letters, I had to make these missionaries' letters sensible. So I actually ran into a professor, a PhD student, and this was in the 70s, long before I started a PhD, who knew that Sign Magazine had something about the Passionists. And he was looking at this writer, Shen Song Wen. So Shen Song Wen wrote novels about the local area of West Hunan. So when I was at Georgetown, I had used Jeff Kinkley's book, and he published The Odyssey of Shen Song Wen. And I asked Professor Howard Spendelow, who was one of my professors, if I could do some reading of the novels of Shen Song Wen, because the novels actually humanized the missionary writings of all the Passionists in the 1920s. And, and it showed the incredible stamina, but also the independence of this area. So the Passionists were in a very strong minority area with Miao culture and two bandits. And I love this quote of Shen Song Wen. It says a lot about China when you unpack it. He was actually a scholar who suffered a great deal. And he says, as Jeff Kinkley puts it, I have a rule. Once people are promoted to high office, I no longer seek to have social intercourse with them. That is a very important statement to see how relationships change in China over time. But this writer, over my years of going to China, at least 9 to 10 times, when I mentioned Shen Song Wen and West Hunan, people know I have an understanding of China, and that allows doors to open and discussions to ensue. So here are the scholars that the three of us, myself, Ed McCord, and Jeff Kinkley. It's important to see this, and this was recently at the Asian Studies meeting. Ed McCord is an expert on warlords. Jeff Kinkley, as I just mentioned, looked at the idea of the work done by Shen Song Wen. So together, we unpacked the area of West Hunan. Now, I'm going to move a little bit more rapidly through this area of Luan. Luan really means chaos. And this term chaos, as I began after 1992, I began to say, how do I understand Hunan province and all of China as I began to teach Chinese history? And chaos really is a rich political term, Luan. It talks about murder, it talks about relationships, it talks about fragile relationships, sexual relationships. All of these aspects are key, and Luan is a multi important term that encompasses a great deal of realities in Chinese society. And this is really what the Passionists and all of China were dealing with at the time. I'd like to take a moment and just look at this particular photo. Again, I did not use or interpret photos in 1992 in my dissertation. This all emerged in the actual digitization of the Passionist China collection in cooperation with the Ricci Institute, which was then at the University of San Francisco. Here you have on the right-hand side, looking at the images, you see the Christmas decoration of the inside of the church, which was built by the Spanish Augustinians, and you see it decorated in black and white photography. However, these images would be sent home, colorized, and then the priests and many people would go out to home parishes and they would colorize. And so they would humanize, actually through coloring, they would humanize the reality. So people began to actually take away a reality of Chinese life that they could identify with. This is called Lantern Slide Lectures, and Joseph Ho, a scholar at Albion College, and also Margaret Kuo, who's in the California state system in Long Beach, have done work on the role of this lantern slide in these imagery. And if anyone wants to learn about that, I would help them find those sources. But this prayer and stewardship, raising money, this was how it went and took place through these images that sometimes were colorized. The other thing that was important to see here is travel was overland. So this is setting us up to understand why these priests were murdered. The boat really was the avenue of transit, the norm and overland. And you can see the rough terrain. This is all completely changed now in China today. But you see on the right, you see the boatman who's naked, if you look closely. And what they would do when the sisters, I learned this from Sister Carita Pendergast, what they would do when the sisters were on the boat, they would pay the boatman extra money to wear clothes so as to not scandalize the sisters. That's one story I recall. But this was treacherous overland travel. Here you see Polong. This bandit, you see him in red, was, I was shocked when I came and saw this particular image, because he actually became an important vice premier of the People's Republic of China. He eventually joined the communists in the late 1920s. But here you see one of his relatives gets married at the Catholic Church, and you see this photo of him with the Catholic, and you see the complex community that's taken place. What this really says to me is, for the Chinese scholars and State Department and all the people have to realize that bandits actually became members of the nationalists and the communists over a course of times, and oftentimes switched sides. So this image of Ho Long asks for a redefinition of bandit theory, of the role of bandits, and how bandits actually interacted with the missionaries at this particular time in the 1920s. Here you see Ho Long coming to the topic again. Ho Long is actually a bandit, but now you see the Protestant missionary, and in red you see Constantine Leach, who was the priest who died of typhus. You see the Protestant missionary and Leach cooperating together, taking care of one of Ho Long's soldiers. And so this is a very transitory period and a very transitory time. And this bandit relationship and missionary relationship actually represents complex economic and social networks of West Hunan. And here you see Godfrey Holbein in transit overland with a soldier guard and mission support workers. So while actually Holbein is killed by bandits, he needs bandits from 1924 until the time of his death. He needs bandits and a guard and workers anytime he traveled. This was a complex network of economic and also social action, of social relationships that everyone benefited from, and misused at times in the 1920s and throughout all the provinces of China. This still needs a great deal of study, and the imagery now makes it even that much more important. So now we go into the actual murder, and we see that what happened was Easter 1929. You had a retreat. So here you see Walter Coveyou, and you see the different men here. You see Coveyou was in his mid-30s. I think he was 35. Holbein was the youngest. He was just 30 years old, and Seybold was about 32 years old. So Coveyou has the mustache, Seybold has the beard up in the right, and Holbein is on the bottom there to the right. But this, there's many photos of this group because it's an important meeting. And so a random photo actually now becomes a key photo in retrospect. And on the notation, it says this was taken at the annual retreat a week or so before the terrible crime. Godfrey had a premonition of his death for months before. He told me repeatedly the end would come and it would be a violent death. But keep in mind that my feeling is that Holbein had a lot of anxiety, and it was anxious, just normal movement across the time in travel. So anxiety was a norm, and Holbein actually manifests that, but all the missionaries lived with anxious travel at that particular time. This actually is something that when I actually saw the situation emerge in the archives, I was completely shocked by this. This actually humanized the whole event. Here you see the actual documents that officially were sent back to the United States to show the murder of these three priests. So they were shot by bandits. So who killed them? Shot by bandits. All it says is bandits. It says that on all the documents that these priests have no personal effects. So you begin to see the simplicity of their life. Here's the other two death certificates, shot by bandits, and actually typhoid fever is what Leach dies of. But this is important. They're buried outside the city in the Catholic cemetery, outside the East Gate. So this was helpful. Later on, when I visited Hunan in 1989, I could see, even though these graves were effectively impacted by the Cultural Revolution, I could see where these graves were. So we keep moving, and we see now, again, the historic grave sites. There's many photos of their actual grave and grave ceremony, and you see the local Catholics. There's processions that are emerging here. You see the mounds of the grave were actually done in traditional Chinese style. So these graves represent, in some ways, the enculturation of death, and they're using white banners for the sign of mourning. So this is the cultural banners to show the sadness of the event. But this whole death has another implication with the Holy See. So the apostolic delegate from 1922 to 1933 is Celso Constantini, an Italian. What he promotes is a vision of respect for Chinese. He does it through church architecture. There's a papal encyclical, Rerum Ecclesiae by Pope Pius XI. And then Constantini issues pastoral letters in 1927 dealing with make sure you act prudently in military, during this time of military action, because this was the time of the Northern Expedition. So he says to the missionaries, don't take any unnecessary risks, but act prudently. And then later on, he says, thankful for you who have remained at your post, but he says, be careful here. This is a very complex world we're in now between nationalists, communists, Bolsheviks, terminology, all of these different people. Don't write on political affairs in newspapers. China is a very complex world, and he's trying to keep the the missionaries in somewhat of a neutral position so that they can actually enter and be a voice of a participation with Chinese Catholics and Chinese society. He is very active in trying to make this adaptation and is actually quite progressive. And I don't think that scholars have really seen how differing the Holy See policy was, for example, from the United States or other foreign policies of other nation states, which you will see in a moment by some of this information that I have. So this actually is a much bigger area in the 1920s and eventually throughout China. And you see in the red listing there, you see that missionaries are being killed. So there's Belgian, there's German, there's Franciscan, there's from 1923. You see also in the footnotes, there's what they call the mulatto case, who in 1923, he is killed and murdered by bandits and held as ransom. The Costantini says, okay, we're going to use the money for his death, which by right they could, to build a hospital. So Costantini is actually shifting the way of indemnity use. He's not going to take money, and if he does take money, it's going to be for the good of the Chinese people. But reinvestigation of how all these murders took place, what was the actual response of these particular religious orders to the situation, and how did the respective governments, whether they were German, French, US, or other nations, how did they respond to these political circumstances, and were they satisfied with the justice that might have been impacted at that time? This is a wide open question, and religious archives hold this answer. This now turns to the second part and is key in my understanding of the missionary case in 1929. The Passionists did not ask for indemnity on the murders. So they said these Passionist priests live in according with the gospel idea. So actually Costantini goes, and he's in the United States for medical treatment at the Mayo Clinic, and he works with through the hospital sisters up in Springfield, Illinois, and he gets some medical attention. But he also takes the time to go and meet with Stanley Hornbeck, who's in the State Department. And this now is from Foreign Relations, again, in the United States. What this says here is Hornbeck says, you know, missionaries have to really be careful here because martyrdom is important, but missionaries, when they're killed, they're important, and missionary death and is still a citizen dying. And this has tremendous implications on our foreign policy because a business and also Protestant missionaries are involved in this. So Hornbeck is making the case that this is not a simple thing, and you can't just use this religious identity. There's a real civil identity here. And the Archbishop comes back and says, to the question that Hornbeck says, that Costantini said, my missionaries are going to stay at my post, at their post. They are going to remain at the post. And Hornbeck said, that's an embarrassment. You can't do this because the Chinese government is fragile and the Chinese people. This is a very, very difficult situation, and it's particularly fragile if a missionary is killed. The Archbishop Costantini says that the church is not going to ask for indemnities. That was true in the Passionist case. So he's reiterating it 2 years later. And he says the exposition of the difference in the viewpoint of church and state, but he says that the missionary feels a special obligation to the constituents and must give no sign of apprehension or fear. So essentially what Costantini, by the time he's there from 1922 really until 1934 when he leaves, he's arguing that the missionaries actually are going to hold their own and they are not going to get out like the Protestants and evacuate. Now, granted, the Protestants had family. and they were in situation. But he says, throughout China, we are going to hold with the people because that's our mission as missionaries for the gospel and the people. Essentially, they agreed that care of China and the state and individuals are important and they will work together, but they disagreed on the particulars of the nuances. So this is an important break or a divergence between the position of the Holy See and the position of the U.S. State Department at that time. And I learned this by doing it's what I said, citizenship and gospel. It becomes important here because we're shifting now on the implications of what this 1929 death has. So you see here Cormac Shanahan, and you see him up there where he is actually with the, you see him where the arrow is pointing to him, and you see Mao Zedong, and the Passionist archives in China archives and China collection has his diary, which was given to me, and you see Caspar Caulfield with Bishop O'Gara. So in 1 year, you see a Passionist meeting with Mao on a press party, which I've written on, and you see also Bishop O'Gara meeting with Chiang Kai-shek. They are both at this point in the Second United Front, Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, but of course they're at odds with one another. And the reason that this is taking place is Chiang Kai-shek is asking or thanking the bishop for support of refugees because he didn't have the infrastructure to do it. So in Hunan, the Passionists take on refugee work, and Shanahan is up there with the press because actually Mao wants support from foreign powers. So he's part of an assigned Western group of reporters, and this shows the importance of Passionists being in complex situation for the good of the gospel. But I think in my mind, it has given me stamina to realize that being in diplomatic situation is not something that Passionists should actually walk away from, but being in diplomatic complex realities are something where as long as discussion is the possibility, the Passionists with training, with insight, with knowledge should actually try to be in situations that bring reconciliation. That's what I've learned looking at these two photos. I'm not going to spend time looking at this, but in 2023, there was the local people actually exhumed the bodies and they put this grave site into play. So this in the town, and I was there for the rededication. There's 9 Passionists, 6 Sisters of Charity, 1 Grey Sister, and 1 medical doctor. If you wanted to read more on that and some of the implications of that visit and some of the aspects about the lives of all these particular people on this gravestone, you could actually read some of these articles, and I'd be happy to forward them to that. So the grave actually was rebuilt and through the local people themselves. One of the Sisters of Charity, the relatives, they went in 2014 and they visited the grave. So 10 years later, you can see the deterioration of the grave. I haven't been there, so I don't know what the situation is now. But you can see that this is how the size of the grave, and this was built by the local people and through donations of the respective Passionist and religious orders. Here you also see, we're coming to the end now, we're seeing something very important. While the life, death, and memory of the 3 priests ask us about diplomatic and social and political situations, you see Bishop Cuthbert O'Gara, who you remember was meeting with Chiang Kai-shek, and you see him being released from prison in 1953, and you see actually, in 55, Marcellus White and Justin Garvey. The question becomes, and this is where my thought is right now, how to determine this overall narrative of Passionist missionary life and this idea of understanding. Is this missionary experience one of suffering? Is it really looking towards reconciliation? Is persecution the normative idea? we have to go back now and look at religious archives and civil narratives and look at Protestant and government archives. And we have to ask, are these terms equal? Because if you listen to the news today, you hear constantly about persecution. Rarely do you hear about reconciliation, and rarely do you hear about suffering. I think persecution is a little bit strong. I equate that with death. That's my interpretation. Others might say otherwise, but suffering, I think, is the norm here. And in China, for religion at this point in time, and what I've learned from Marcellus White and Justin Garvey is to quest the reconciliation narrative. I think that's what I've learned from them. And I've seen that in action in my own experience in China. Also, one of the things that's most surprising, and I'm just showing this, over the course of time, there are now at least 6 to 8 Passionists, Chinese Passionists in China. And I've had the opportunity to be with them over various visits. So I just want to show that. I'm not going to spend time discussing them, but I do think it's important that when people think about the Chinese Catholic Church, there are Chinese Passionists and they are doing ministry in China, and there is a relationship. So the Chinese Catholic Church is vibrant, it's real, and it is an important aspect to look at in a concrete reality of local circumstances such as the Chinese Passionists have. And then you can expand this out in the last couple images here. Father Carl Schmitz, he went in 1948 to China, then went on to Japan, and then went on to the Philippines. So if you look at the life, death, and memory of the 3 priests who were killed in 1929, and were they martyrs? Technically, no, but culturally, I would say yes. You could look at the murder of Carl Schmitz, whose life actually and death is being put forth as a cause by the Philippine Passionists. So he was killed in eco-justice theology and a gospel witness. And I would say that this is something that needs investigation. And then you have another more complex era of Passionists in Bulgaria with Eugene Basilkov, who was actually in 1952, and he was executed. They never found his body. So he's an important person who actually was persecuted and was the bishop, whereas O'Gara came out, so did Justin Garvey, and so did Seybold, so did Marcellus White. Towards reconciliation. But this cause here of Blessed Passionist Bishop Eugene Basilkov really is about a persecution narrative and a world faith witness. And then I have to say that as I began to study this whole period of these murders, I often, as I'm reading and continue to read in so much of the 1920s to 1950s period, I continually think about Father Rick Frechette in Haiti. Rick Frechette in Haiti, and I've talked with him at times about this, Rick Frechette in Haiti actually mirrors all the chaotic realities that day-to-day life in 1920s China was. Bandits, kidnappings, executions, burying of orphans, burying of children with disease. You see this image of Father Rick Frechette burying at a grave site. This was done, and I believe, if in talking at times with Father Rick Frechette, he thinks about the mission in China at times in his own prayer life, as I have, to understand how do you witness as an American citizen and a missionary in these complex realities when death is all around you and your witness is there, and how do you handle civil society in a complex world of Haiti, which has all the trappings and the realities of 1920s China. And you see in the news that it's a chaotic situation that no civil society or government can take a grasp of. So I mentioned Rick because this is important, I think, for our framing of contemporary reality. And then just the last couple images. This was the 80th anniversary of the death of the missionaries. So Father Michel Marcial, Ed McCord, myself, the late Kathleen Lodwick, a Protestant scholar, Joseph Lee of Pace University, and Jeff Kinkley. The missionaries are remembered as theological, military, and interfaith and cultural event. This was the first time really that we brought this event into the public consciousness in a very real way. And then here you see the images of these three priests in Scranton. They were used in the 90th remembrance at an exhibit on the Passionists in China at the University of Scranton. But you see where I am on the right, you see some notations, and these, I put together some prayers. So it talked about really Walter Coveyou as a preacher, that donations, large or small, spiritual donations, sacrifices, unite us with people of the world. Holbein, with his daily anxieties and sanctified his presence, he lived with these. So we face daily trials. How do we identify with anxieties that we meet each day? Can we pray to Godfrey Holbein to sort of sanctify these and give us hope? And Clement Seybold has an awareness of social religious pulse, and he has courage, leadership, and we need to be in that situation at times, and we at times have to enable the powerful and the powerless to cooperate with one another. So all these men have a life, death, and memory of Passionists that I think have gone way beyond what I started in 1992, and they are a tremendous witness and meditation for us in a complex world of China today. So here I am, which is a very favorite photo of mine, in front of the grave of Matteo Ricci in 1610. I think it's really important to try to meditate on the memory of these missionaries. It's really who died in 1929. And one of the ways you can do it is you can go to a conference like the U.S. China Catholic Association is going to have. If you'd like to go and learn more about the Catholic Church in China, which is a vibrant church. I just was in China from March 18th to April 12th. It's a vibrant church that people should learn about, and it's much more real and human beyond the headlines. And this Catholic Church is real, and you can go and look about that conference and the Ricci Institute where the Passionist China collection is. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll take some time, let's see, for questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I will ask that perhaps I'll ask Claire or Ryan, who are co-hosting here, sort of to lead me, and maybe they might read out the question, and I'll try to answer very short. But either put your hand up or put in the chat, and I'll try to answer the numerous questions. If you should know that this is being recorded, and we will eventually put this up in some platform so people can see it if you came in late. I appreciate your kindness in attending this conference. Yes. Any question?
There's one question in the chat, Rob.
Yes.
Let's see. At the time of the murders of the Passionist missionaries by bandits, did the Chinese government want missionaries to be serving in China, or was the Chinese government against allowing religious missionaries to be in China? I.e., how dangerous was it to be a Passionist in China at the time, and how dangerous is it today? You say it's different, but here in the U.S., we think...
I would say that the missionaries actually... I think at the time it was important to have missionaries in China. They were all over China, Protestant and Catholics. So I think that was an important dynamic, and their importance has to be taken and looked at locally. Each province had its own issues. In some ways, the missionaries brought stability, and that was an important dynamic for the history of the time. But each decade, the 20s is different from the 30s. 37 to 45 is war with the Japanese. So refugee work becomes highly important. Many missionaries are interned under the Japanese from 43 to 45 in internment camps, Protestant and Catholic. Then the Chinese Civil War recreates another whole aspect. So the whole climate of missionary participation is consistent but constantly changing decade to decade and province to province. What was the question on the contemporary point, Ryan?
I think let's see. How dangerous is it today?
Well, the Catholic Church, there's about 10 million Chinese Catholics in China. They are able to worship. When I was in China, I went to Easter at the Xi'an Cathedral. There's actually a directory, the U.S.-China Catholic Association. Anyone who wants to go to a Catholic church in China as a foreigner can attend. You have to follow the protocols. If you're a Catholic priest, and you're not allowed to publicly do liturgy unless you have special permissions. But any Catholic, any foreign Catholic can attend. And the Catholic Church is an active Catholic church with different realities in different areas. But there is a Catholic Church that is there. Protestants also have a strong area, maybe about, some say, between at least 20 million, so at least double. And they're much more Bible driven, where many Catholics are more in a sacramental situation. The Chinese Catholics, every time I've been with, have a strong relationship and respect for the Pope and Rome, and they mention the name of Pope Francis or Pope Benedict in the Eucharistic prayer. So there's no alienation from the Catholic Church by Chinese Catholics. Another question.
Next question. Could you please explain more about what you mean when you say they were cultural martyrs?
Yeah, this whole sense of martyrdom is a theological issue. I have to admit that where I've gone down is much more of a political, military identity, given what I've seen in the Passionist China collection. But the theological issue of cultural martyrs, the missionaries themselves at the time said, bandits killed these 3 priests. They weren't necessarily killed by the faith. They were not held for ransom. So they were just killed. So did the bandits know that they were they killed for the faith? And there was a little bit of a debate in the actual missionary letters by Father William Westhoven, who was a superior at the time. And so I think the culture of the American headlines said they are martyrs. Why? They sacrificed their life. So I think that's where I would say the cultural idea of martyrdom. The other aspect here is what I learned in writing the dissertation is, because the situation was so complex, death in service to the gospel isn't just about the priests anymore. People who are doing refugee work, or even this goes today, they really are suffering for the faith, and so they die for the faith. So I think what's happened, you see this identity of martyrdom in the 20th century has shifted from 1929 to the present day. And so, again, theologians might want to revisit this. I should say something about Father William Westhoven. In an interview I did with him, and I was fortunate to do interviews with people who were still alive when this 1929 murder came. One of the things that Westhoven did not do, as I recall, he did not go to a banquet that took place after the deaths. He just was so upset. He says, this shocked us as a young mission of missionaries. It brought a reality check to us that we're really in a very complex situation here. This is not a romantic enterprise we're in. Any of us could be killed. So he didn't go to the banquet. Why is that important? The banquet, no matter in the difficult situation, is what they call a show of face, a show of respect. That's what you do in good times or bad times to keep the relationships real. And at times, Father Westhoven said, I wonder if I did the right thing. But at the moment, I just was so angry at this event that I just couldn't show up at that banquet. So that's an interesting point that he left. So the cultural martyrdom, I think I'll leave that to the theologians. I've been looking at military theory. So that's that. Another question.
Did the bandits who killed them take anything, and were they ever caught?
That's actually, I'm glad my thesis committee of Emmett Curran, Dorothy Brown, and Father John Whiteheck, I'm glad they didn't pursue the fine print, because what I found was they robbed, there was a robbery, but I think they just were trying to rob things. And from the State Department case, it said that certain culprits were caught and killed. But by the time, as I showed in that Foreign Relations of the United States, and William Westover, I think, actually wrote this back to the consulate in Hankow. He said, you said Shen Ziming was killed, but we still have him roaming the countryside. He wasn't killed. I think what they did was, this was a power play of the government of Hunan, the provincial government, with bandits to somewhat gain control. Father Caspar Caulfield thought this was a much more theological idea. I disagree with him on that. I don't think it was. I think this was just a bandit murder, and unfortunate. And the real culprits, I don't think, were ever caught, because bandits were just hard to deal with. And no one really had control of that area. This was a bandit infested area. So I don't think they were ever really caught. But people with better skills in Chinese and wanted to deal with this, there's more literature, I'm sure, could investigate it and prove me wrong or prove me right. Other comments? We have about maybe time for 3 more questions. It's about 8:30, so we'll take 3 more questions and then leave.
Can you chat for a minute about the difficult transition that Bishop Auger, Father Bill Westhoven, and other Passionists experienced after their expulsion from China?
Yeah, I think each person dealt with it in their own way. You got to remember that Bishop Auger was also was in 1941, was in Hong Kong when the Japanese came in and almost died there. But he was released through the prison because of his Irish ancestry. And the Irish were neutral because the Italians and the Germans were allied in some form with the Japanese. So the neutral Irish, and because O'Gara had Irish ancestry as a Canadian, he was able to be released in 1941. So he did not die. So what we have here also is the question of adaptation. In the adaptation situation, O'Gara came back after his imprisonment, really a strong advocate of anti-communism. And that was norm for a lot of missionaries. The persecution and the suffering was genuine, real, and they saw that. So that was important. And then the other aspect was that White and Garvey came back, but they did not deal with the press as some of the other missionaries did. The press used these missionaries to talk about the evils of communism, which were real in the 50s. But the missionaries sometimes refrained from political discourse. I have to study more on this. But I find that what surprised me most was, while O'Gara saw communists in a very real way by the time he died in 1968 through his experiences with, actually, I went back to China with Father Marcellus White, and he really, and Garvey really looked towards reconciliation. And that's where I got my vision really in a very concrete way. So other missionaries for the Passionist mission, went to the Philippines. Some went to Jamaica, West Indies, and so Korea, Japan. So this mission had a second life, but some of the complaints were that these missionaries were trapped in a Chinese mindset, and they couldn't move out of China because it was such a harrowing experience. Rightly so. You have to remember the mission was there from 20 to 55, and it was a very complex one. So some adapted well, some had nervous breakdowns, or at least I think had trouble adjusting back to the US. But I believe they were all heroic men and women, also the sisters as well, who were in service there. So you have to look at each individual case, which would be a very interesting thing to look at. Two more questions.
Did the national government blame any political party for the murders?
The nationalist government, I don't think, I'd have to go back and look at the dissertation. Hunan province was really a chaotic show of miscontrol. And West Hunan was pretty much an independent area. So the nationalist government was more in the eastern sector in 1929 and trying to hold that together. The bandits held the western province, was where western part of the province was, which was where the Passionists were. And you have to remember that just in 1929, what was percolating was the Maoist understanding in Jiangxi of Mao Zedong's remnant, and the encirclement campaigns were trying of the national government were trying to suppress Mao. So Mao had remnants of his troops, and Hulong actually, who you saw in that photo, actually became part of Mao's organization and went through as part of what I see as a second long march through West Hunan. So Hunan actually is one of the last provinces that Mao takes control of, even though it's his home province. And West Hunan was one of the last areas. And actually, the missionaries in the 1940s and 50s thought that this whole communist idea was going to be a short-lived idea. They thought they were going to go back to a 1920s warlord's reality. And I think we're very surprised with the collapse of the nationalist government in 49 and 50 and the impact of the Chinese Communist Party. And that became more complex with the Korean War. So the nationalists had a hard time holding control of that Hunan province. And the last question, Luke.
I see one up here that I missed earlier. I guess the question is, what's the current relationship of the Chinese church and the Roman church?
Yeah, I think it's a question of dialogue, of trying to keep different methods of dialogue or communication open. Accords that are done right now with the Holy See and with the People's Republic of China and religious affairs deal with the naming of bishops. And some people have criticized Rome because they say that they've sort of let the authorities in China hold the cards more, and there's tensions on that. But other people say, listen, we're not going to make any progress unless we do have dialogue, unless we do have ways. And so there's two roads of thought, and I guess this idea of maintaining a relationship, I would be of the advocate that as long as you try to have an honest relationship, and at times both sides have tensions about trusting one another, and both sides, the Holy See, to the best of their ability, and also the PRC, they operate in diplomatic world, which means they put cards on the table, but they operate in complex realities. And what you see in the public isn't always what's necessarily going on. It's not that everything is secretive, but I think it's a much more complex reality. All I can say is right now, the reality is both are aware of each other's respectful situations in trying to have a Catholic Church. If you want to learn more, I think come to the U.S.-China Catholic Association Conference, because we will have some bishops from China there discussing their reality of what the Catholic Church is about, and experts on that. So there's a lot of opinion. The press weighs in all the time. I guess I would end up by saying is I don't think it's as dire, having been there just this past month for Chinese Catholics. I think it's a human, and the Catholics who are there are strong Catholics, unified with the world aspect. And they know that the missionaries, the Catholics, that I would say is the last point, they know that the missionaries who came there from Europe and the United States in the 1800s and the 20th century, and I think this is true with the Protestants, without that sacrifice, without the educational or other areas, this their faith would not be alive today without the missionary presence. So they're thankful. And every time I'm there, they say, make sure the people in the United States know, at least in the United States, that we Chinese Catholics thank them. We're praying with them and we're praying for them. We are part of the world Catholic faith as much as they are, and we share in that together. So anytime you go to China, you know, if it's all possible, it's worth visiting a Catholic church in the major cities where Catholic Chinese faith is worshipped. So with that, I thank all the people who helped make this. I thank all of you for waking up at different hours across the world and across these time zones. And if you want to reach out to me, you can go to the Passionist Archives at gmail.com and send me an email or contact us through, and that would be one way. But thank you very much. And I think we will end it there.